Hey guys, today I'm gonna talk about basic authentication in ASP.NET Web API. Basic authentication is the easiest way you can authenticate your web request. And if you're doing any school project where authentication is not the major part of your project, basic authentication is the way to go. And even if you want to use JWT or better or OAuth authentication methods in your web request, I think it's better if you understand how basic authentication works before you jump into advanced authentication methods. So what's the problem statement? So we created this ASP.NET Web API, then we installed EntityFramework Core so that you can talk to our database. And we have our clients who are talking to our web API in JSON format. But some of the information that we have in our database is sensitive information, right? Like if our clients are trying to log in into system and if they want to validate the user, they cannot really pass email address and password as query parameters or route parameters. That's the bad way to go about it. So how do we pass email address and password? That's the problem. How do we pass email address and password in encrypted format and not in query parameters or route parameters? That's where basic authentication comes into play. So this is a bad way. This is not the good way to go about it. We should use basic authentication. So for basic authentication, what you do, you pass an encrypted string of your email address and password. In my case, I'm going to use email address : password, and you can use any encryption method. Make sure that you have this decryption algorithm for that too. You can use secret key for encryption and decryption, which only your clients and servers can access. But for this demo, I'm just going to use convert base64 to convert my email address : password into an encrypted string. And then I'm going to use from base64 method to bring back my, to decrypt my encrypted string. So for this method, what you do, you add authorization header and then basic space the encrypted string of your email address and password. But okay, this is good when client knows that okay, they have to pass basic space encrypted string of their email address and password. What do we need to do on web API side? That's important, right? So for web API, what you need to do, you need to create a handler which will handle all these sensitive requests. So if client asks for data, when client sends authorization header and the encrypted email address and password, web API should know how to handle those requests before sending sensitive information, right? So these are the steps that we need to follow. These are the steps that we need to follow for our ASP.NET Web API Core 3.1 project. So what we'll do, we'll follow the steps one by one, and then we'll enable our ASP.NET Web API to handle authentication, to handle these requests so that it knows that the user is authorized to ask for this information. So the first thing that we need to do, we need to enable our ASP.NET Web API for authentication. And then we'll have to create this authentication handler of type authentication scheme options. And then we will have to use this authorize tag, authorize attribute on one of our controllers, which is going to send sensitive data so that the controller knows that it should go and first use this authentication handler before it sends sensitive information. And to make these two ends meet, what you need to do, you need to tell your services, your ASP.NET services, to add this basic authentication handler as authentication before sending the sensitive information. And then we're going to use authenticate result fail and success depending on if the user is valid or not. We're going to use EntityFramework Core for validating the user against our database. And authentication header value is something that we use for reading for reading the authorization header from our web request. All right, so I have already, I'm going to use Postman tool for testing this. And I've already created this web request, which is get user, and it's passing email address of John Smith and password, which is already an encrypted password, but still we shouldn't pass even encrypted password in query string. And it's returning the whole user. Okay, so how do we fix this problem? How do we get rid of this email address and password from our query string and pass it in our authorization header, and make our ASP.NET Web API enable to handle this request? All right, so the first thing that you need to do is you need to go to your startup class, and here before authorization, tell your app that is going to use authentication. Nice. And then now our app knows that we could send some requests which need to be authenticated. Second thing that you need to do, you need to create authentication handler. So let's go ahead and create authentication handler. What I'm going to do, I'm going to create a folder here. I'm going to create a folder, call it as handlers, and I'm going to add a class and call it as basic authentication handler. Nice. See, this is the class which will handle the requests which are coming from clients. And I'm going to inherit authentication handler for that. We'll have to bring in some namespaces here, bring in that, and then we'll have to tell our authentication handler which scheme that is going to use, what type of scheme it's going to use. So I'm going to pass this as a type. It's going to throw an error here because we need to implement the abstract class here. You can see that it wants us to call this function handle authentication async, which will get called whenever a request needs authentication. All right, so, and it's still giving an exception because it's asking for a particular kind of constructor. For that, I am going to copy some code here. I'm gonna say my basic authentication handler, it takes these parameters in the constructor, and let's bring in some namespaces for it. It takes authentication scheme as options and passes to its super class here, and it takes iLogger factory as parameter and URL encoder, all that good stuff. All right, so now you can see that our authentication handler is happy. What I'm gonna do, I'm gonna return, instead of throwing an exception here, I'm going to return authentication result here. I'm gonna say authentication fail and say that we need to implement instead of throwing an exception. And this is an async function. Nice. So okay, so we now have the handler here, and then we will have to go and tell our controller, a user controller, which has sensitive information, that it needs to get authorized. It needs to get authorized before sending the request, before sending the data. Okay, so to do that, you just use this authorize attribute on top of the controller. And you can use this authorize attribute in any of the functions if you want to. All right, so we have authorized. We want our controller to be authorized, but our controller doesn't really know which authentication to use, right? To do that, to make these two ends meet, we'll have to go to our startup class again and tell our services that we add authentication here. We need to add authentication of type basic authentication. This is just a name name identifier. So I'm gonna pass this string. I'm gonna say that it's basic authentication, and then it's gonna ask for which scheme that you're using. So for scheme is of type authentication scheme options, and the scheme that we're using, it's basic authentication handler. And then again, it takes the name identifier, which is same as this, and then it takes some config, which I'm going to pass as null. And I'm gonna bring in some namespace here. Nice. So now our ASP.NET Web API knows that, okay, this is the authentication that you have to use. And before sending any request from user controller, make sure that you are calling this basic authentication handler. What I'm gonna do, I'm just gonna put a breakpoint here, and we're gonna run our Web API to make sure that it calls handle authenticate async before calling user controller. Okay, so I'm gonna run it. And you can see that now it's my Chrome is pointing to API user, which is the user's controller, and it's passing, it came to this handle authentication async before it went to our users function to return all the users. Okay, so let's go ahead and implement this handle authenticate async. And you can see that in Chrome, it's throwing this 401 error, which means that it's unauthenticated. If I go to my Postman, and if I try to now get the user by email address and password, if I send this, you can see that it's trying to go back to the handle authenticate async. And if I continue, then you can see that it throws 401 unauthorized error. So we managed to filter the request saying that, okay, you need to authenticate before asking this information. So let's go ahead and handle this request. The first thing that you need to do, you got to make sure that you have the authorization tag in your headers. So I'm going to check if authorization is mentioned in the web request or not. If it's not mentioned, then I'm gonna say that, okay, you gotta return fail and say that authorization header was not found. Nice. Now we know that authorization header is there, so let's read this authorization header. To read this authorization header, what I'm going to do, I'm going to use this authorization header value, and I'm going to use parse. I think we'll have to bring in some namespaces for this. Yep, nice. And we'll have to parse our request. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to say request headers, and let's parse authorization header, and we'll have to bring in into a var character here. So what I'm doing is I'm reading the authorization header value from my header and putting it into a var here. So I'm gonna say var authentication header value equal to this. Nice. So now we have the authorization header value, which has our encrypted string, and we would like to convert this encrypted string into proper string, into bytes. To do that, what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna go to I'm gonna say convert from base 64, and I'm gonna pass this authentication header value. authentication header value and parameter, which will give me the bytes, which I need to convert into proper string. To convert, we know that the encrypted string was passed as one of the parameters, one of the basic parameters in authorization tag. We converted that into bytes, and we'll have to convert these bytes into proper string. To do that, what I'm going to do, I'm going to say encoding. We'll have to bring in a namespace for this, and I'm going to use UTF-8 get string, and I'm going to pass these bytes into this so that it will get the proper string as credentials. So basically we were trying to decrypt the encrypted string which has been passed into a proper string. Okay, so let's test this. So what we have here is I'm gonna put a breakpoint here, not here, and I'm going to step through this and show you how it exactly works. For that, first we'll have to encrypt our email address and password. For that, I'm going to use this website base64 encode, which will encode my email address and password, and then I'm going to use that encrypted string and pass it as headers into my request. So what I'm going to do, I am going to use John Smith as one of the parameters, and the second parameter is the password. And when I click on encode, I do get this encrypted string. So you pass this encrypted string, which is the username and password, into our authorization header. So now we do not need this. We need a header, which is an authorization header. And here I'm going to pass basic space, the authorization, the string that we just copied from here. Okay, so now if I click on send, I need to run my web API here. So now if I click on send here, you can see that it came again. It's trying to handle authenticate async. It's trying to handle our web request, and this time we have authorization header into our request. Let's try to read this. So if I get this request authentication header value, you can see in parameter the encrypted string that we passed, we are able to read it in our authentication header, and which will convert into bytes, which we cannot really read. But when we convert these bytes into string using encoding UTF get string, then you can see in our credentials John Smith @gmail : password of John Smith. So this is how you can filter your request. This is how you can pass authorization parameters in authorization. And if you have any if you're questioning this method, like even authorization is getting authorization header could get exposed, you should use HTTPS, which will encrypt everything in your header. So all right, so now we have username and password, we have email address and password of the user who's trying to access the information. What I'm gonna do, I'm gonna try and split this string. I'm gonna try and split the string into two, and here we will get string array, and string email address is the first, it's credential first, which is John Smith, and string password, which is credentials second parameter. Nice. Now we have email address and password, which has been sent in authorization header. Here we will have to validate this email address and password against our database. So for that, what I'm going to do, I'm going to copy paste some I'm going to inject my DB context. And you can use any method here. You can use your own class or services to authenticate your user. You don't really have to follow the same method, but here I'm going to inject my DB context so that I can use it. I'm going to say book DB context, and then I'm going to assign my context with this. Nice. So now we have our DB context. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to get user, which is context users, where user is user's email address is the email address which has been passed in authorization header, and user password is equal to password which has been passed in our authorization header. And I'm going to get first or default value here, first or default user. Nice. So now we have we are checking if the authentication request which has been passed is proper or not, valid or not. But we could get some exceptions here, so let's just put some try and catch and make sure that we have valid requests. So I'm going to put some try and catch and copy this, paste it here, and if we get an exception, then I'm gonna say authentication has failed, and the message is error has occurred. Error has occurred. And then we could get no user, right? So that also we will have to handle. So I'm gonna say user is equal to null. Then also we'll have to pass, we have to fail this authentication, and I'm gonna say invalid username or password. You figure that out. Else what I'm going to do here, I'm going to create identity. I'm going to copy paste some code from here and paste it here. So what I'm doing, I created some claims which is taking the user, which if it's a valid user, then I will create some claims, an identity and principal, and I'm creating a ticket of authentication ticket type of the same scheme. And that is what I'm going to return as success. I'm going to say that finally we have success, in which is the ticket which has been created by the user, which has been passed in authorization header. Let's get rid of this, we don't need that. All right, so now we have the user which we are trying to pass in our authorization, and then it should handle the requests which have been sent by a client. Okay, so how do we read this user in our users controller? So now in our get user, we do not really need these parameters. We are not passing email address and password as query strings. So how do we read this? How do we read our email address? To read that email address, I'm going to say HTTP context user identity name, and we will just pass the email address of the user. We don't need password, we are already validated that. And before sending the user, what I'm going to do, we are already making sure the password is null here. So even if you are authenticating the user information the response that you're sending, make sure that you do not have any sensitive information in your response. All right, so yeah, let's go ahead and test it. We have our basic authentication handler set up, and we have our users controller set up. So now I'm gonna go to my Postman here, and here I'm not passing email address and password in my query string. I'm passing the encrypted string into authorization. Let's run this, and we're getting some error. Okay, we'll have to maybe pass this as fail if it doesn't go in any else block. Let's return this. There you go. I think it should be happy. Oh, we'll have to put some return here. That's why we're not getting. Okay, there you go. Maybe that will be good. All right, let's run this. Maybe we do need to return here. For fail, we need to pass some string. There you go. All right, now it will work. There you go. Okay, so now we have our authentication, our basic authentication handler and user controller ready for handling the requests. So I'm gonna test this from the Postman tool, and I have my query ready, I have my API request ready, and I have my authorization header ready. So when I click on send here, boom, there you go. So now I did not pass email address and password of the user. I pass encrypted username colon password in my authorization, and I'm getting the response in my JSON. If I modify this, if I add D here and send the request, then you can see that we are not getting any request back. All right, let's try some other user. Let's try going into our database. I'm going to go to my database, so show some table data. And I'm going to use the first user and go and put it here. And I'm going to get their password. Get their password and put it here. Put it here. Encode that string. Copy that string and put it in the basic authentication here. Basic authentication here. And when I click on send, boom, there you go. You're getting the first user ID, paula.acorti@gmail.com. So this is how you can, pass your email address and password in your web request and make sure that you're not passing any sensitive information over the network. In my next videos, I'm going to talk about how we can use JWT and OAuth and better for advanced authentication. And if you have any questions about this demo, you can reach out to me on Twitter or Facebook. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching. Bye.